My name is Seraphina, and I am 42 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've been the keeper of our family's memories. While other people collected jewelry, gadgets, or trophies, I collected moments, each one carefully pressed into the pages of the photo albums I began building when I was only a teenager. Vacations, birthdays, holidays, everyday laughter, every smile and tear of our lives lived on in those pages. They weren't just photos to me. They were proof that we had been here, that our lives had meaning, that love and struggle both deserved to be remembered. But to my siblings, those albums meant nothing. To them, they were clutter. Outdated junk. Heavy stacks of paper that only took up space where something shinier, newer, or more profitable could sit. And that difference between what I saw as priceless and what they saw as garbage was the difference between me and them. It had always been there, simmering just beneath the surface, and I suppose I should have seen it coming. I was the oldest of three. My sister, Valencia, was the glamorous one. She had always lived for the spotlight, always angling for attention and applause. My brother, Dorian, was the ambitious one, the businessman, the deal-maker, the one who thought life was about winning and measuring every moment in dollars. And then there was me, the quiet one, the sentimental one, the caretaker. They liked to joke about how I lived in the past, as though memories were something to be ashamed of. But I loved those albums because they were the one thing my siblings couldn't distort. Photos didn't lie. They showed who was present and who was absent. They showed who laughed together, who stood apart, who carried the weight of family when no one else would. When our parents passed, the albums became my lifeline. I would sit on the floor, flipping through the pages for hours, remembering my mother's gentle smile, my father's strong hands holding us when we were small. I could hear their voices in those pictures. I could feel them close. Without those albums, I would have felt untethered, as though I had lost them completely. And maybe that's why my siblings hated them so much. Because the photos didn't flatter them the way they wanted to be flattered. Because they couldn't rewrite history when it was staring back at them in black and white. For me, those albums were sacred. For them, they were disposable. That difference became the wound that never healed. I think part of me always hoped that Valencia and Dorian would eventually come to appreciate the albums. That maybe when they were older, when their own children asked questions about where we came from, they would finally see the value in remembering. I thought maybe, someday, we'd sit together flipping through the pages and laughing over the hairstyles, the awkward poses, the way Dad always blinked right as the camera went off. I thought the albums might heal us, but instead, they destroyed us. The day they threw them away, I felt something inside me break. It wasn't just about the photos, it was about what they symbolized. Those albums held my heart, my parents' memory, our family's story, and with one careless decision, my siblings told me exactly how little I mattered to them. That act wasn't just cruelty. It was erasure. They weren't just tossing away paper and ink, they were trying to erase me from the family's narrative. And the worst part? They thought they could get away with it. They thought I would stay quiet, like I always had. They thought I would accept their cruelty, shrug my shoulders, and keep carrying the burdens they refused to lift. They thought the photo albums were the only proof I had of my worth. They didn't know that I had another way of being remembered. They didn't know that while they were trying to erase me, I was writing myself into permanence, because one day, I would leave behind something they could never destroy. A truth so sharp it would cut deeper than any insult they had ever hurled at me. And when that day came, they would finally understand what those albums had really meant. That was the moment I knew things would never be the same. We were siblings by blood but strangers in spirit. Growing up, I always believed family was supposed to mean unity. But in our house, family meant division. Even as children, it was obvious how different we were from one another. My parents used to say it was just personality, that every child has their own gifts. But the truth was simpler. My siblings had always believed they were above me. Valencia was the kind of child who could walk into a room and make it hers. She was pretty in a way that drew people to her, and she learned early that attention was currency. Compliments were her oxygen. If she didn't get them, she'd create drama until she did. My parents indulged her, always excusing her behavior as Valencia being Valencia. Dorian, the youngest, grew up spoiled by his role as the only boy. My parents worked hard to provide for us, but he never seemed to understand the meaning of effort. If he wanted something, he got it. When he wanted a new toy, he got it. When he wanted a car at 16, my father stretched himself thin to buy him one. He learned to equate love with material rewards, and that lesson never left him. And then there was me. I was the quiet child, the one who didn't demand, didn't stomp my feet, didn't throw tantrums. I was steady, dependable. My mother leaned on me when Valencia's vanity wore her out. My father trusted me to handle small chores when Dorian's entitlement left him frustrated. I was the reliable one, and for a while, I thought that was a compliment. But being reliable meant being invisible. As we grew older, those differences only deepened. Valencia's world became social circles, beauty contests, and eventually her carefully curated image online. She lived for the eyes of strangers, not for the bonds of family. Dorian threw himself into business schemes, constantly chasing the next deal, the next opportunity to prove he was the most successful. He was a man who measured everything in numbers, even people. And me? I stayed close to home. I worked, I saved, I cared for our parents as they aged. I wasn't glamorous, I wasn't rich, but I was present. Every holiday dinner, every hospital visit, every late-night call when mom's pain spiked or dad's memory slipped, it was me who answered. My siblings visited when it was convenient. Valencia would breeze in, snapping photos with our parents for social media before rushing back out the door. Dorian would appear with a gift, usually something expensive but thoughtless, before disappearing again, claiming he was too busy to stay long. And every time they left, I was the one cleaning up, soothing hurt feelings, and holding everything together. They liked to call me old-fashioned. They'd roll their eyes when I talked about traditions, or when I insisted on keeping mementos. Seraphina, Valencia would sigh, you're stuck in the past. Nobody cares about that stuff anymore. Dorian would laugh and add, yeah. You waste too much time on things that don't matter. Pictures, keepsakes, it's all just junk. But to me, it wasn't junk. It was proof that we had lived, that we had loved. What they dismissed as clutter, I saw as history. The tension between us grew sharper after our parents started declining. I begged Valencia to visit more often, to sit with Mom the way Mom had once sat with her. She always had an excuse: her career, her friends, her mental health. I asked Dorian to help Dad with his paperwork, but he waved me off, saying he didn't have time to deal with trivial stuff. Trivial. That word cut deeper than he realized. They didn't see caregiving as real work. They didn't see memory keeping as real value. To them, I was the foolish sister wasting her life in service of things that didn't matter. But when I looked at my parents, at the lines in my mother's face, at the sadness in my father's eyes as he realized his independence was slipping, I knew the truth. Love wasn't measured in applause or money. It was measured in presence, in sacrifice, in the quiet moments no one else saw. I began to resent my siblings for how little they gave, for how quickly they dismissed me, for how easily they lived their lives while I carried all the weight. And that resentment simmered silently inside me, hidden behind polite smiles and tired nods. The photo albums became my refuge. Each time Valencia mocked me, I would run my fingers over the worn pages and remember Mom's laughter, Dad's pride, the rare moments when we were actually a family. Each time Dorian dismissed me, I would trace the photos of him as a boy smiling, innocent, before greed turned him hollow. Those albums were my anchor, the reminder that I wasn't crazy for believing family should mean more than money or attention. But my siblings didn't just dismiss the albums. They dismissed me. They treated me like I was wasting my life, like I was irrelevant, like I had nothing of real value to offer. And the more they tried to erase me, the more I clung to those albums as proof that I had lived, that my sacrifices weren't in vain. I should have known that their disdain for me would one day boil over into something crueler, that their disregard for my albums was only the beginning of their disregard for me. But back then, I still held on to hope. Hope that one day they would open their eyes and see me. Hope that they would sit with me, flip through those pages, and finally understand why I had kept them safe all those years. It was a fragile hope, and it was about to be shattered. They never realized how much those albums meant until it was too late. Illness has a way of showing who people truly are. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my father, it was subtle. He had always been sharp, the kind of man who could recite dates from history or quote entire passages of poetry without missing a beat. But one evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, he looked at me with confusion in his eyes and asked, "Where's your mother?" My heart sank, because she had been standing right behind him. At first, we told ourselves it was nothing. Just forgetfulness, just age. But soon the lapses grew longer, deeper. He forgot names, forgot directions, forgot even the stories he used to tell so proudly. Watching my father, the strongest man I knew, fade piece by piece was one of the hardest things I had ever endured. And then came my mother's illness. Hers wasn't of the mind but of the body. Pain that started as a dull ache turned into a consuming fire. Hospital visits became routine, prescriptions stacked on the counter like tiny soldiers in a battle we could never win. She tried to hide her suffering, to smile through it. But I saw the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. I stayed. Of course I stayed. I became their caretaker, their nurse, their advocate. I learned to measure time not in hours but in pills, in appointments, in good days and bad days. I slept lightly, always ready to rise at the sound of a call. I gave up promotions at work, gave up vacations, gave up nearly every piece of my life outside those walls because they needed me more. Valencia and Dorian didn't stay. Valencia would visit every few weeks, sweeping into the house in a rush of perfume and expensive fabric. She'd smile for pictures with our parents, post them online with captions like, "Family is everything," and then leave within an hour. She never noticed how drained Mom looked after posing, or how Dad grew agitated when too many faces came and went. To her, those visits weren't about being present, they were about being seen. Dorian was even worse. He'd show up unannounced, carrying some gadget he claimed would make things easier. He brought a state-of-the-art pill dispenser once, boasting about how it cost hundreds of dollars. But he never stayed to make sure Mom knew how to use it, never cared when Dad grew frustrated trying to figure it out. He'd pat me on the shoulder, say, "You've got this, Seraphina. You're the responsible one," and disappear again into his world of deals and deadlines. I carried the burden they refused to share. There were nights when I sat alone in the dark, listening to my mother's labored breathing, and wondered how my siblings could live with themselves. How they could sleep peacefully knowing I was awake, exhausted, holding everything together. I wanted to believe they didn't understand, that maybe they were just too selfish to see the weight I bore. But deep down, I knew they understood perfectly well. They just didn't care. It was during those long nights that the photo albums became my sanctuary. When the weight of caregiving threatened to crush me, I would take one off the shelf and open it to a page from brighter days. There was Mom, laughing at a birthday party, her face glowing with joy. There was Dad, holding Valencia on his shoulders at the beach. There we were, 3 siblings, tangled together in the grass, smiling without bitterness. Those images reminded me that once, we had been something whole. That once, family had meant love. I clung to those albums because they were proof that what I was fighting for mattered. Proof that my parents' lives were worth remembering in full, not just in their suffering. But to Valencia and Dorian, those albums were just clutter. They'd see me flipping through them and roll their eyes. "You spend too much time in the past," Valencia would say, adjusting her lipstick in the mirror. "You should learn to move on." Dorian would laugh, adding, "Nobody cares about those old photos, Seraphina. You need to think about the future, not the past." The future. To them, the future meant money, property, assets. I began to notice the way Dorian's eyes lingered on the house, calculating its value. I noticed the way Valencia asked about jewelry, about furniture, about anything that might be worth something. They weren't interested in our parents as people anymore. They were interested in what our parents would leave behind. And that realization broke something inside me. How could they look at Mom's frail frame and see only the necklace around her neck? How could they look at Dad's fading memory and think only of the house he built? It was in those moments I understood that my siblings and I weren't just different, we were worlds apart. They measured life in possessions. I measured it in memories. And while I was fighting to preserve what made our family whole, they were already circling like vultures. I still held on to hope, though. I thought that maybe, when the time came, they would surprise me. That maybe grief would soften them, awaken something human inside them. I thought losing our parents might bring us closer, but I was wrong. Because while I was clinging to memories, they were already plotting how to erase them. But while I clung to those memories, they plotted how to erase them. Each page was a piece of me, a piece of them. The photo albums were not just paper and ink, they were the threads that stitched our family's story together. I started the first one when I was 14, a cheap little scrapbook I bought with babysitting money. I filled it with snapshots from disposable cameras, pictures of birthday cakes, school plays, vacations, and quiet afternoons on the porch. Over the years, the collection grew until the shelves in my parents' living room bowed under the weight of nearly 30 albums. Every book told a chapter of our lives. The covers were mismatched, some worn leather, some patterned fabric, some plain cardboard, but together they formed a library of us. The edges of the pages curled from being turned so often, the plastic sleeves yellowed with age. But I didn't mind. That wear was proof that these books had been lived in, loved, held. When I flipped through them, it was like time travel. There was Mom in her Sunday dress, holding me as a baby. There was Dad teaching Valencia how to ride a bike, his hand steadying her while she laughed with her whole face. There was Dorian at the county fair, his grin smeared with cotton candy. There were family barbecues, Christmas mornings, and long, hot summers by the lake. The albums were alive with our history, and every page carried a story only I seemed to remember. One photo showed my mother in the kitchen, flour on her cheek, rolling out dough for a pie. I could almost smell the cinnamon and sugar, hear the sound of her humming under her breath. Another showed my father's calloused hands as he worked on the car, grease staining his fingers but pride shining in his eyes. They weren't just images, they were pieces of their souls captured forever. To me, the albums were sacred. My parents knew that too. When Mom's memory started fading, she'd ask me to sit with her and show her the pictures. Sometimes she would cry softly, other times she would smile and whisper, "Oh, I remember that day." Those moments were a gift, tiny windows of clarity that only the albums could open. Dad, too, loved to linger over them when his strength allowed. He'd point at younger versions of himself and chuckle, shaking his head at the passage of time. Before they passed, both of them told me, in quiet moments, "Keep these safe, Seraphina, they're for you." They didn't say it to Valencia, they didn't say it to Dorian. They said it to me because they knew I understood, but my siblings never valued them. When I tried to show Valencia the albums, she would skim a few pages before yawning and saying, "You really should scan these, nobody keeps paper anymore." For her, memories only mattered if they could be filtered and posted online for likes. Dorian was worse. He would glance at the shelves and say, "Do you know what this house would be worth without all this clutter? People want clean lines, open spaces. This stuff just drags the place down." To him, the albums weren't memories. They were obstacles to resale value. Their words cut me, but I told myself it didn't matter. I still had the albums. I still had the stories. I could keep them safe, even if no one else cared. But deep down, I longed for them to see what I saw. I longed for my siblings to sit beside me, to place their hands on those pages, and to realize that these weren't just photographs, they were proof of who we were, proof that we had been a family, once. I dreamed of us finding connection in those albums, of laughing together at bad hairstyles, of crying together over the faces of loved ones gone. I thought maybe the albums could be the bridge between us, the thing that healed the rift, but instead, they became the wedge that tore us apart. Looking back, I think my siblings resented those albums because they couldn't rewrite them. They couldn't control what the pictures revealed. The photos showed who was missing when birthdays were celebrated, who stood apart when group pictures were taken, who looked away instead of looking home. They told the truth in ways Valencia's curated feeds and Dorian's bragging never could. The albums exposed them. And maybe that's why they despised them so much. To me, they were love. To them, they were a mirror they didn't want to face. I didn't realize then how far their contempt would go. I thought they would ignore the albums, dismiss them, maybe tease me for clinging to junk. I never imagined they would actually take action. I never imagined they would cross the line from cruelty into destruction. But that's exactly what they did. But they treated them like garbage. I came home to find the shelves bare. It had been an ordinary afternoon, or at least it was supposed to be. I'd run errands in town, picked up groceries, stopped at the pharmacy, mailed a package, nothing out of the ordinary. When I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, I felt that familiar ache in my chest, the one that came from knowing they were gone but the house was still full of them. I carried my bags inside, humming absently to myself, until I stepped into the living room and froze. The shelves were empty. For a second, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The space where the photo albums had always been 30 volumes, spanning decades, was stripped bare. Only faint outlines of dust remained, little rectangles marking where the albums had sat for years. My heart dropped. I set the groceries on the floor, my hands trembling as I rushed from room to room. I checked the coffee table, the dining room, the hallway closet. Nothing. The albums were gone. Panic surged through me, hot and dizzying. I tore through the house, opening drawers, scanning shelves, looking for any sign that they had been moved, maybe stored somewhere safe. But deep down, I knew. I knew what had happened before I even heard their voices. From the kitchen came the sound of laughter my siblings's. I stormed in to find Valencia sipping a glass of wine, leaning against the counter like she owned the place. Dorian was beside her, grinning as though he'd just won a game. When they saw my face, Valencia tilted her head and smirked. "Oh, don't look so shocked, Seraphina," she said lightly. "We did you a favor." "A favor?" My voice cracked. "Where are the albums?" Dorian waved his hand dismissively. "Gone. We tossed them. Honestly, you should be thanking us. Those things were ancient. They were making the place look like a thrift store." My knees nearly buckled. You threw them away?" Valencia rolled her eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. They were just old pictures. Who cares? Nobody even looks at photo albums anymore. Everything's digital now. You're clinging to junk." "Junk?" The word tasted bitter on my tongue. "Those were our lives. Our parents. Every memory. Memories don't pay bills." Dorian cut in, his tone sharp. "You think buyers want to walk into this house and see shelves full of musty albums? No. They want clean lines, modern touches. We're thinking ahead, Seraphina. You should try it sometime." Their words pounded against me like blows. Each syllable ripped at me, shredding the careful sanctuary I had built out of those albums. My parents' faces, their laughter, their hands holding mine, erased. I stumbled back, pressing my hand against the wall as the room spun. "How could you?" They told me. They told me to keep them safe." Valencia sighed dramatically, swirling the wine in her glass. "Our parents also told us to live our lives, not drown in the past. Honestly, Seraphina, you've let yourself get stuck. Maybe this will finally force you to move forward." I stared at her, hardly able to breathe. "Move forward? You destroyed everything that mattered to me." Dorian shrugged, unapologetic. "Not everything. The house is still here. The money will still be here. That's what matters." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about albums. This was about erasure. They hadn't done this to clean or to modernize. They had done this to remind me that I didn't matter. That my memories, my sacrifices, my role in the family were worthless. To them, I was nothing but an obstacle standing between them and what they wanted. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, to grab them by the shoulders and shake them until they understood what they had done. But instead, I stood there in silence, tears burning behind my eyes, and let the weight of their betrayal sink into me. Because it wasn't just paper they had tossed away. It was me. They had thrown me out with those albums. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. The grief that had consumed me, the quiet acceptance that had defined my life, it all crystallized into something new, something sharp. I realized then that if they could so carelessly erase the very proof of our family's existence, then they had already erased themselves from mine. They thought they had won, that they had broken me once and for all. But what they didn't know was that their betrayal wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of theirs. In that moment, I knew they had erased themselves from something much bigger. It wasn't just about photos anymore, it was about me. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake in my parents' old bedroom, staring at the ceiling, hearing their laughter echo in my head like a cruel chorus. The shelves were empty, but my mind wasn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the albums piled high in some dumpster, pages torn, pictures smudged, moments of my life scattered in filth. I thought of Mom, her fragile hands gripping mine as she whispered, "Keep these safe, Seraphina." I thought of Dad, pointing at a photo of his younger self and chuckling, "That was a good day." Those albums weren't just my inheritance, they were my parents' last request. And my siblings had spat on it. For years, I had been the silent one, the reliable one, the one who swallowed pain and carried on. Every insult, every dismissal, every time Valencia or Dorian belittled me, I endured it. I told myself it was easier to keep the peace. That one day, they would come to understand me. But standing in that empty living room, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me, I realized something. They would never understand. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. To them, I was nothing but a shadow. Someone who existed to clean up their messes, to hold the memories they couldn't be bothered with, to carry the burdens they dropped. And now, they had made their message clear. I didn't matter, but they were wrong. The anger that rose in me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't a sharp burst of rage that came and went. It was a slow, steady fire, burning hotter the more I thought about it. They had tried to erase me, but what they didn't realize was that their act had awakened something in me I had buried for too long. Resolve. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, my hands folded in front of me, staring at the empty shelves. The silence was thick, but inside me, a decision was forming. I would not be erased. I would not let their cruelty define the story of my life. They thought the albums were all I had. They thought that by destroying them, they had destroyed me. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the will I had already begun to draft in my mind. They didn't know that while they were mocking me, I had been watching, remembering, and planning. I realized then that the albums had always been more than just pictures. They were proof of presence of who showed up and who didn't. And if my siblings wanted to erase that record, then I would create a new one. One they couldn't throw away. One written not on fragile paper but in ink and law. For the first time in my life, I felt powerful. Not because I could confront them directly, shouting at Valencia would only make her smirk, and arguing with Dorian would only fuel his arrogance. No, my power would be quieter, sharper. I would let them believe they had broken me. I would let them keep underestimating me, keep laughing at me. And then, when the time came, I would make sure they realized just how wrong they had been. As the sun rose, light spilling into the kitchen, I made myself a promise. I would no longer measure my worth by their standards. I wouldn't beg for their recognition or waste another second, hoping they would see me. Instead, I would make them see me whether they wanted to or not. That morning, when Valencia strolled into the kitchen with her phone in hand, and Dorian followed behind her with his smug grin, I smiled. Not because I forgave them, not because I had forgotten, but because I finally knew what I would do. "Morning," Valencia said casually, pouring herself coffee. She didn't even notice the way my hands curled around the mug. Steady now. No longer trembling. "Morning," I replied smoothly. My voice didn't shake either. Dorian leaned against the counter. "You're not still upset about those albums, are you?" He laughed as though it were ridiculous. Come on, Seraphina, they were just paper, let it go. I looked him right in the eye, my smile unwavering. Of course, I said softly. Just paper. They exchanged a glance, smirking, certain I had folded. They had no idea. That night, I called a lawyer. The plan that had been a whisper in my mind became a vow. If my siblings wanted to erase me from the past, then I would erase them from the future. And when that future came, they would finally understand what those albums had really meant. They thought they'd erased me, but they only erased themselves. While they laughed, I was writing my truth. The very next morning, after a sleepless night of turning over plans in my head, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It belonged to Amelia Crane, a lawyer I had met through a community fundraiser. She wasn't just skilled, she was sharp, patient, and compassionate, the kind of woman who didn't dismiss people the way my siblings always dismissed me. If anyone could help me turn my resolve into something permanent, it was her. When she answered, I almost lost my nerve. My voice trembled as I asked if we could meet, if she had time to help me prepare some important documents. She didn't press me for details. She simply said, "Come by this afternoon, Seraphina. We'll talk." That simple kindness steadied me. I didn't tell Valencia or Dorian where I was going. Let them believe I was still sulking about the albums, still licking my wounds. They thrived on thinking they had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let them see what I was building in the shadows. When I walked into Amelia's office, she greeted me with a warm smile and ushered me into a quiet room lined with bookshelves. "What can I do for you?" she asked gently, folding her hands on the desk. I took a breath and told her everything. About my siblings, about the albums, about the years of sacrifice that no one ever noticed. I told her about the empty shelves, the cruel laughter, the way they treated my parents' memories like garbage. And as I spoke, the fire inside me grew hotter. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was determined. When I finished, Amelia's eyes softened, but her expression was firm. "You want to make sure they don't benefit from your life," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she had pulled straight from my heart. "Yes," I whispered. "I want to make sure that when I'm gone, they can't twist the story. I want my voice to be heard, loud and clear." She nodded once. "Then we'll make it happen." For hours, we worked through the details. She asked questions about my assets, my accounts, my property. I had never thought of myself as wealthy, but as she listed everything out, I realized I had more than I'd ever given myself credit for. Savings, investments, the house. Small heirlooms that carried both sentimental and financial value. Individually, they didn't seem like much, but together, they formed a legacy. A legacy I could direct however I wanted. And that's exactly what I did. We drafted a will that cut Valencia and Dorian out entirely, save for one detail: symbolic gifts that would sting far more than silence. For Valencia, a single, torn photograph from one of the albums she had thrown away. For Dorian, one of Dad's old work gloves, patched and stained, the opposite of the wealth he worshipped. The rest went to people who had shown me love when my siblings hadn't. To friends who checked on me, neighbors who helped shovel snow, cousins who brought meals during the hardest times. I designated donations to charities that supported families like ours, so that others would have the help I never received from my own blood. Every decision was deliberate, every line was a statement. But the most important clause was the one Amelia insisted on including. The will would be read aloud, in full, with all beneficiaries present. That way, Valencia and Dorian would have no chance to twist the narrative, no way to pretend they hadn't been called out. They would sit in that room, forced to hear my words, forced to face themselves in front of everyone else. As Amelia wrote, I felt a sense of control I hadn't known in years. For so long, I had let my siblings define me. But here, in ink and paper, I was defining myself. I was shaping the ending of my own story, one they couldn't rewrite or destroy. When we finished, Amelia looked at me with a quiet pride. "Seraphina," she said softly, "this isn't just a will. It's your voice. It's your truth. And no one, not your siblings, not anyone, can take it away from you." I left her office lighter than I had felt in months. Outside, the air was crisp. The sky stretched wide. And for the first time since that horrible day in the living room, I felt hope. Not hope that Valencia and Dorian would change, they never would. But hope that, when the time came, they would finally be held accountable. At home, I said nothing. When my siblings sneered at me, when they mocked me for still being upset about old junk, I smiled faintly and stayed silent. They mistook my quiet for surrender, but it wasn't. It was strategy. Because every cruel word they spoke, every dismissive laugh, only made my resolve stronger. They thought they had erased me, but they were only helping me carve my truth deeper into stone. And one day, when they least expected it, they would hear that truth spoken aloud. The will would be my voice when they tried to silence me. Greed makes people reckless. The more time passed, the more brazen my siblings became. It was as though throwing away the photo albums had unlocked something inside them, a shamelessness that no longer bothered to hide itself. They strutted through the house like it was already theirs, talking openly about what they would change, what they would sell, what they would keep. Valencia paced the living room one afternoon, gesturing toward the walls as if she were conducting a photo shoot. "We'll knock this wall out. Maybe put in a big mirror here, something sleek, modern. This furniture has to go too old-fashioned. Honestly, Seraphina, you should be happy. This place will finally look like it belongs in a magazine." I stood in the doorway, listening to her words as my hand brushed against the empty shelves where the albums had once been. My throat tightened, but I said nothing. Dorian, meanwhile, was glued to his laptop, crunching numbers. He tapped the keys rapidly, then spun the screen toward Valencia. "If we list the house in the spring, we'll catch the market at its peak. Between this place and Dad's land, we're talking 6 figures each. Easy. Maybe more. We should get it appraised as soon as possible." "Each?" I asked quietly, raising an eyebrow. He barely glanced at me. "Of course. We'll split it 3 ways. Well, technically. But we both know you're not really in a position to handle that kind of responsibility. It might be better if we manage things for you. Don't worry, you'll get your share. Eventually." His words stung, but not because I believed them. They stung because of the smug certainty in his voice, the assumption that I was weak, incapable, irrelevant. I wanted to scream, to remind him that I had been the one who managed Dad's bills when his mind started slipping, that I had been the one who organized Mom's medications, who kept the house running, who kept them updated when they couldn't be bothered to show up. But instead, I bit back the words and forced myself to remain calm, because this was exactly what I needed. The more arrogant they became, the harder their fall would be. At dinners, they spoke as though I wasn't even in the room. Valencia would prattle on about how she'd finally have space to entertain, as if the home we'd grown up in was nothing but a backdrop for her vanity. Dorian would smirk and talk about investments he'd make once the estate came through. I sat quietly, eating my food, nodding occasionally, letting them believe I was broken, defeated. In reality, I was memorizing every word, every sentence that dripped with greed, every laugh that dismissed me, every plan they made without me. These weren't just conversations, they were evidence. Proof of who they were. Proof of how little they valued the life we had shared. The irony was almost poetic. They believed they were erasing me, but they were really writing my story for me. Every cruel remark, every selfish plan, became fuel for the will Amelia and I had crafted. One night, I overheard them in the kitchen. "She's pathetic," Valencia said, her voice low but laced with venom. "Still moping around like those dusty books meant anything." "Honestly, it's embarrassing," Dorian chuckled. "Yeah. But let her mope. Makes it easier for us. She won't fight. She never does." I pressed my back against the wall, closing my eyes as their words washed over me. For a moment, the old Seraphina stirred, the one who swallowed her pain, who accepted their cruelty, who let herself be invisible. But then the fire rose in me again. They thought silence was weakness. They had no idea silence could also be power. Let them talk, let them laugh, let them plan. Every word only tightened the noose they were unknowingly slipping around their own necks. The strangest thing was how light I began to feel. For years I had carried the crushing weight of trying to prove my worth to them. But now, I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need their approval. Their contempt had freed me. Because once someone makes it clear they don't see you, you realize you don't have to live for their gaze anymore. I started to smile more, but not for them. For me, because I knew something they didn't. They thought they were waiting for me to die so they could collect their prize. But in reality, I was waiting for them to live long enough to hear my voice one final time. The will was ready. The stage was set. And every day that passed brought us closer to the moment when their arrogance would meet its end. The higher their arrogance climbed, the harder their fall would be. My body reminded me that time is not endless. It started as a heaviness in my chest. At first, I brushed it off as exhaustion. I was still running myself ragged, trying to hold the house together while pretending my siblings hadn't gutted me emotionally. But then came the shortness of breath, the dizziness, the way my hands trembled when I tried to carry something as light as a basket of laundry. I went to the doctor expecting reassurance, maybe a prescription for vitamins, maybe a reminder to sleep more. Instead, I found myself sitting in a sterile room as he frowned at my test results. "Seraphina," he said gently. "We've found some irregularities. It isn't catastrophic right now, but you need to understand. Your health is declining. Stress will only make it worse. If you want more years, good years, you'll need to rest. You'll need to let go of some burdens." Let go. The words pierced me. Because for most of my life, letting go had never been an option. When Mom needed care, I didn't let go. When Dad's memory faded, I didn't let go. I held everything, carried everything, and sacrificed everything while Valencia and Dorian lived untouched by responsibility. But as I sat there, staring at the doctor's concerned eyes, I realized something with startling clarity. If my time was shorter than I thought, then I couldn't waste it waiting for them to change. I needed to finish what I'd started. When I left the clinic, the autumn air felt sharper, the world louder. Every step reminded me of my fragility, but also of my purpose. I wasn't powerless. I had already taken control. Now I just had to ensure there were no cracks for Valencia or Dorian to slither through. I called Amelia the next morning. "I want to finalize everything," I told her. My voice was steady, but my heart pounded. She didn't hesitate. "Come in, we'll make sure it's airtight." For the next several weeks, Amelia and I combed through every detail of my will. She double-checked the signatures, the witnesses, the filing. We updated clauses to close any loopholes. We made copies, each sealed, each stored safely in different locations. She explained how she would handle everything once the time came, how the beneficiaries would be notified, how Valencia and Dorian would be summoned, how every word would be read aloud in front of them. "Once this is done," she told me firmly, "there is nothing they can do. They can rage, they can threaten, they can try to contest it, but they will lose. This is your voice, Seraphina, and it will stand." Hearing that gave me a peace I hadn't felt in years. At night, when the house grew quiet and the shadows of memory pressed close, I would take out the draft of the will and read it. Line by line, I saw my truth preserved. My voice. My justice. My love for those who had cared for me, written into permanence. And my disdain for those who hadn't, carved into stone. I thought often of my siblings during nights. They never asked how I was. They never noticed the weight in my steps, the paleness of my face. If they did, they ignored it. The only time they spoke to me was to ask about the estate. "When are we getting the appraisal?" Dorian would press. "Have you thought about moving out? It would be easier if we just listed the house." Valencia would add. Not once did they ask about my health. Not once did they offer comfort. And that told me everything I needed to know. If there had ever been a flicker of hope that they could change, it was gone now. Their greed had consumed them entirely. They weren't my family anymore, they were strangers in familiar skin. So I poured myself into finishing my plan. Every clause, every instruction, every symbolic gift was chosen with purpose. The charities I named would carry forward compassion my siblings had never shown. The scholarships would open doors I never got to walk through. The neighbors and friends who had shown me kindness would know that their care had not gone unnoticed. And for Valencia and Dorian, they would receive only reminders of what they had destroyed. Not wealth, not comfort, but echoes of their cruelty. As my health declined, I grew weaker, but I also grew freer. Because I no longer lived under the illusion that my siblings might one day see me. I no longer wasted my energy trying to be visible to people determined to look past me. Instead, I focused on being remembered by those who mattered. There was a strange relief in knowing the end was coming. Not joy, not exactly, but a sense of closure. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had written my own story. Not the story Valencia wanted to post online, not the one Dorian wanted to tally in dollars, but my story. The real one. And when the time came, they would hear it. Not whispered. Not dismissed. But spoken aloud, clear and undeniable. If they thought I'd leave them my life, they were wrong. When I left this world, I left my voice behind. I could feel the end long before anyone said the words aloud. It wasn't dramatic, not like in the movies, with sudden collapses or frantic emergencies. No, my end came quietly, creeping in like a tide that slowly rose higher with each passing day. My breaths grew shorter, my steps slower, my body more fragile. But instead of fear, I felt something surprising, calm. For most of my life, I had lived in service of others. I had been the caretaker, the quiet one, the invisible backbone of a family that never noticed how much weight I carried. I gave until there was little left of me. But in those final weeks, I realized something this time. I wasn't giving my last days away. I was claiming them. I stopped answering Valencia's shallow calls and Dorian's clipped questions about appraisals. When they did bother to check in, their voices were always sharp, impatient. Seraphina, you need to sign this paperwork. Seraphina, when are you moving out? They spoke as though I were already gone, as though I were just a hurdle standing between them and what they thought was theirs. But I didn't sign, I didn't argue. I simply smiled, nodded, and let them think I was too weak to resist. All the while, I knew the truth they had already lost. Amelia visited often in those last weeks. She sat by my side, not as a lawyer, but as a friend. Sometimes she read to me from books I loved, sometimes she brought tea, sometimes she simply sat in silence, her presence enough to remind me I wasn't alone. One evening, I asked her if she thought people would remember me. Her answer was steady, unwavering. They will, Seraphina. Because you've made sure of it. Her words filled me with a peace I can't describe. I spent my last good days walking slowly through the house, touching the furniture, the walls, the worn spots on the floor where life had happened. The kitchen where Mom baked pies, the garage where Dad worked on the car, the yard where we once played as children. I lingered in front of the empty shelves where the albums had once stood, the shelves my siblings had stripped bare. But instead of sorrow, I felt resolve. They had destroyed the physical proof, yes. But they hadn't destroyed me. My memories were still here. My truth was still alive. And soon, my voice would speak louder than theirs ever could. The last night I was conscious enough to sit upright, I pulled out the final draft of my will. I read it one more time, tracing the words with trembling fingers. Each sentence carried a piece of me. Each clause was a declaration. I mattered. My sacrifices mattered. My love mattered. And my siblings' cruelty would be remembered too, but only as a warning. When the end finally came, it wasn't violent. It wasn't even sad. I lay in my bed, the same one my parents had once shared, and stared out the window as the sky shifted from pale pink to deep night. The stars seemed impossibly bright, like lanterns waiting to guide me home. I thought of my mother's laughter, my father's strength, the moments of joy that had filled our home long before bitterness seeped in. I thought of the girl I used to be, flipping through photo albums on the floor, dreaming of the life ahead. I thought of the woman I had become, tired, yes, but unbroken. Stronger than my siblings ever believed me to be. And then I let go. The world blurred, the stars dimmed, and the quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. My last thought was not of anger or grief, but of certainty. Because even as my body gave out, my story was waiting to be told. Valencia and Dorian would sit in a room, surrounded by relatives, expecting riches and praise. Instead, they would hear me clear, steady, undeniable. They would hear how their cruelty had carved their own fate. They would see how their laughter had written their downfall, and I would have the last word. They would hear me, louder than ever, after I was gone. Their smug smiles. It didn't last long. The day of the will reading arrived like a storm that had been building for years. My body was gone by then, but my voice remained bound in the pages Amelia held, sealed with signatures and witnesses. My siblings thought it was just a formality. They walked into that room certain of victory, blind to the truth waiting for them. Amelia's office was modest but dignified. A long, polished table stretched across the center, and the air was heavy with anticipation. Relatives filled the chairs, cousins, aunts, neighbors, friends, people who had been part of my life in ways my siblings had never understood. They had come out of respect, perhaps also out of curiosity. And then Valencia swept in, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, dressed in a sleek black outfit that was more runway than mourning. She smiled tightly at the room, as though it were another audience to impress. Dorian followed close behind, his suit pressed to perfection, his watch gleaming under the light. They carried themselves like royalty, about to collect tribute. I can imagine the smirks they exchanged as they took their seats, confident the day would end with them richer, more powerful, triumphant. But Amelia's steady voice cut through their arrogance like a blade. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Seraphina Hale." The room grew still. She began with the legal declarations, the standard phrases about sound, mind, and intent. Valencia tapped her nails impatiently against the table. Dorian adjusted his tie, already bored, already waiting for the moment the wealth would be divided. And then the words shifted. "To my sister Valencia," Amelia read, "I leave a single photograph. Once, this picture was part of an album filled with our family's laughter, our milestones, our love. But you decided those memories were meaningless. So this torn scrap is all you will ever have, a fragment of the past you threw away." Gasps filled the room. Valencia's face flushed red as she straightened in her chair. "What? That's absurd," she sputtered, but Amelia continued without pause. "To my brother Dorian, I leave one of our father's work gloves. You always mocked his calloused hands, too busy counting money to understand the pride of honest labor. May this glove remind you of what true worth looks like, something you could never buy." Dorian's jaw clenched. His fingers dug into the table as whispers rippled among the relatives. He opened his mouth to protest, but Amelia's calm voice moved forward, unstoppable. "To the friends, neighbors, and cousins who showed kindness when I needed it most, I leave financial gifts and keepsakes. Tokens of gratitude for the love you gave me when my own siblings could not." Gasps turned into smiles, then eyes widened with shock and gratitude. Names were called, amounts read, items described. People who had never expected anything found themselves remembered, honored, cherished. And my siblings? They sat frozen, forced to listen as everything they believed was theirs flowed past them into the hands of others. Amelia turned the final page. "And to the charities that supported my parents and me through illness and grief, I leave the remainder of my estate. May they continue to offer comfort to families like ours, families abandoned by those who should have stood beside them." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking down. Valencia shot to her feet, her chair screeching across the floor. "This is a setup. She was manipulated. Seraphina wouldn't do this to me." Her voice cracked on the last word, her carefully crafted poise unraveling. Dorian leaned forward, his face pale, his voice sharp. "This isn't legal. She was sick. She didn't know what she was doing. He jabbed a finger at Amelia. "You twisted her words. You filled her head with lies." Amelia didn't flinch. She simply slid a stack of documents across the table. "Everything is notarized, witnessed, and filed. Multiple copies are secured in different locations. Contest it if you wish, but you will lose. Your sister's voice is preserved here, exactly as she intended." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Valencia's mouth opened and closed, no words forming. Dorian's knuckles turned white against the table. Around them, relatives exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others disapproving. A few even smiled, nodding as if to say, "Finally. Justice." I wasn't in that room, but I can imagine the weight of it, the smugness draining from their faces, the realization settling in that for once, they had no control, for once their words meant nothing. For once, it was me speaking and they had no choice but to listen. For decades, they had treated me as though I were invisible, irrelevant, unworthy. But in that room, with every line Amelia read, I became undeniable. I had the last word. The room erupted as their faces drained of color. They thought they'd erased me, but they only erased themselves. The news spread quickly after the will reading. In families, nothing stays secret for long. Within days, everyone knew. Valencia and Dorian had been left with scraps, while the bulk of my estate went to friends, neighbors, cousins, and charities. Whispers traveled through phone calls, group chats, family dinners, and with each retelling, the story grew sharper, less forgiving. My siblings had spent their lives curating images of themselves, Valencia with her flawless photos, Dorian with his polished success, but the will stripped those images bare. People saw them now for who they truly were. Valencia tried to save face at first. She went online, posting filtered pictures of herself with captions about rising above betrayal and choosing positivity. But the comments betrayed her. "Didn't your sister cut you out of her will? What did you do to her? Some legacy? Huh?" She deleted the comments, blocked the accounts, but she couldn't block the truth. Her followers dwindled. The spotlight she craved so desperately flickered and dimmed. Dorian fared no better. He had always built his reputation on being the confident, successful one. But now, business partners looked at him differently. Clients whispered behind his back. If his own sister didn't trust him, they asked, "Why should we?" His deals began to crumble, one by one. Meanwhile, those who had been remembered in my will stood taller. My neighbor Mrs. Calder, who had brought me soup when I was too sick to cook, cried when she learned I had left her a portion of my savings. "She remembered me," she whispered, clutching the letter Amelia delivered. My cousin Leah, who had sat with me during hospital nights, received enough to pay for her daughter's college tuition. She told her friends proudly, "Seraphina understood what family really means." The charities I named announced new programs in my honor. Scholarships for students who loved history and storytelling, hospice support for families caring for the ill, grants for community projects. My name began appearing in newsletters, on plaques, in thank you notes written by strangers whose lives I had touched without ever meeting them. And with each ripple, my siblings shrank further into the shadows. They tried to fight it, of course. Valencia threatened legal action. Dorian hired a lawyer to contest the will. But Amelia had prepared everything too carefully. Witnesses stepped forward to confirm my clarity, my determination. Doctors vouched for my sound mind. Every attempt they made only ended in failure, leaving them with mounting legal fees and deeper humiliation. People started avoiding them. At family gatherings, cousins whispered behind their backs. Old friends stopped inviting them to events. Neighbors looked away rather than wave. The stain of their greed was permanent. And I, though gone, was finally free. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible sister, the one they mocked, the one they dismissed. I was the story. The one people remembered. The one they admired for standing her ground, even in silence. My name carried weight, not because of wealth but because of the choices I made. I imagined Valencia sitting alone at her vanity, staring into the mirror, realizing that no amount of makeup could cover the shame etched into her reputation. I imagined Dorian poring over his dwindling accounts, watching the numbers slip through his fingers, wondering how everything he built unraveled so fast. And I imagined them both thinking of me, of the albums they threw away, of the sister they tried to erase, of the truth they could never silence, because the cruelest part of their downfall wasn't just losing money. It was losing the narrative. For once the story wasn't theirs to spin, it was mine, and everyone knew it. They had mocked me for clinging to the past. But it was the past that destroyed them. They had tried to erase the proof of our family's history, but in doing so, they wrote themselves out of its future. It almost makes me laugh, how poetic it all turned out to be. For the first time, I had the last word. Memories outlive greed. Long after the chaos of the will reading faded, something remarkable began to grow in the silence I left behind. My siblings sulked in bitterness, but my choices had already set roots, spreading further than they could have imagined. It started small. The scholarship fund at the community college released its first announcement, the Seraphina Hale Memorial Scholarship for the Arts. A photo of me appeared on their website, alongside words about my love of history and storytelling. Students who had never heard my name before wrote essays about their dreams, inspired by the chance to receive help in my memory. One recipient was a young woman named Isla. She wanted to study photography but couldn't afford tuition. She wrote about her late grandmother and how much she wished she could preserve her family's stories through her lens. When she received the scholarship, she told the local paper, "Because of Seraphina Hale, I get to capture the memories my family almost lost." My heart swelled hearing it, even from beyond. I had given her what I lost. The hospice program, too, bloomed with the support I left them. They bought new reclining chairs for patients, new medical kits for families, and even trained volunteers who could sit with loved ones so caregivers could rest. One nurse told Amelia that the donation came at the perfect time they had been struggling to meet demand, and my gift allowed them to expand. Families who would never know my name felt the comfort I had longed for during my parents' decline. Neighbors like Mr. Alvarez, who had shoveled my driveway every winter without being asked, used what I left him to repair his roof and fix his wife's wheelchair ramp. He told others, "Seraphina noticed the little things. She cared." His words spread through the community, reminding people that kindness doesn't go unseen. Even my cousins, who had only occasionally visited, were stunned to find themselves included. Elise called Amelia in tears when she received her share. "She remembered me," she said. Even after all this time, she remembered. That sentiment echoed across the family gratitude where my siblings had expected greed. Everywhere I had planted seeds, something bloomed. And in contrast, Valencia and Dorian withered. Their reputations never recovered. Valencia's carefully crafted online image crumbled, followers abandoning her for someone more authentic. The whispers about her being cut out of her sister's will clung to her like a shadow. No matter how many perfect photos she posted, people saw the truth behind the filter. Dorian's downfall was quieter but just as brutal. His business deals continued to falter. Potential partners hesitated, wary of a man whose own blood had rejected him. One associate bluntly told him, "If your own family didn't trust you, why should I?" Dorian had built his empire on confidence, but without it, everything collapsed. And I, though gone, lived louder than ever. At family gatherings, my name was spoken with respect. Seraphina was the strong one, they'd say. She understood what mattered. Old friends shared stories about my kindness, my sacrifices, the little ways I had touched their lives. Children grew up hearing about me not as a shadow, but as an example. I thought often of the albums they had thrown away. At first, losing them felt like losing myself. But in the end, I realized something. My siblings could destroy paper, but they couldn't destroy legacy. Legacy isn't measured in objects. It's measured in the lives you touch, the love you leave, the stories others tell about you when you're gone. Valencia and Dorian's legacy was one of arrogance and greed. Mine was one of memory and love. And only one of those outlasted the other. I like to imagine Valencia walking past the college someday, catching sight of my name on the scholarship plaque. I like to imagine Dorian opening the newspaper and seeing the hospice program expanding under my name. I like to picture the way their stomachs twist, realizing they will never leave behind anything so lasting. Because while they chased status and wealth, I chased meaning, and meaning doesn't fade. I was once invisible, overlooked, dismissed as sentimental, weak, irrelevant. But now, my name was carved into stories, into lives, into legacies that would ripple long after my siblings were forgotten. In the end, it wasn't their smirks or their cruelty that defined us. It was my choice, my voice. They tried to erase me, but I became unforgettable. If anyone has ever tried to erase you, hear me now. I told you my story, not just so you'd know what happened to me, but because I know I'm not alone. Somewhere, someone listening has felt the same sting. The feeling of being overlooked, dismissed, treated as though your love, your sacrifices, your very existence didn't matter. Maybe it was family. Maybe it was friends. Maybe it was the world itself telling you that your worth had an expiration date. I lived that. For years, I believed their lies. Valencia and Dorian called me sentimental, stuck in the past, irrelevant. They told me my memories were junk, my efforts invisible, my life small, and for a long time, I accepted it. I carried the burden of silence, hoping one day they'd open their eyes and see me. But here's the truth I need you to hear. You don't need their validation to prove your worth. Your value isn't measured by how others see you. It isn't measured by applause, or wealth, or the curated images people use to project perfection. It's measured by the love you give, the sacrifices you make, the moments you preserve even when no one thanks you for them. For me, the photo albums were more than pictures. They were proof. Proof that we had lived, that we had loved, that even in the shadows of cruelty, there was light. When my siblings destroyed them, they thought they had destroyed me. But what they didn't understand was that our worth doesn't live in objects, it lives in us. And it cannot be erased. Maybe you've been made to feel invisible. Maybe someone has tried to convince you that you're too old, too sentimental, too plain, too irrelevant. Let me tell you something. They are wrong. You matter. You have always mattered. And you always will. The most powerful choice I made wasn't cutting my siblings out of my will, it was refusing to let them define my story. They wanted me to be the quiet one, the background character in their play. Instead, I became the author of my own ending. I chose who would remember me and how. I chose to honor kindness, love, and loyalty over vanity and greed. That's something each of us can do, in our own way. Maybe not through a will, maybe not through legal documents, but through the choices we make every day. Every act of kindness, every moment of presence, every decision to stand up for yourself, it all matters. It all becomes part of the legacy you leave behind. When I look back now, I don't see myself as the sister who was erased. I see myself as the woman who endured, who cared. I see someone who refused to be silenced, even in death. And if you're listening to this, I want you to carry that truth with you. The world may try to tell you that your story is small. Don't believe it. There is no such thing as a small story. Every life ripples outward in ways we may never see. You don't know whose heart you're touching, whose future you're shaping, whose memory you're preserving just by being yourself. Valencia and Dorian measured life by what they could take. I measured it by what I could give, and in the end, mine is the legacy that lasts. So to anyone who has ever been told you don't matter, that you're invisible, that your best days are behind you, you are wrong to believe them. You are still here. You still matter. Your story is still being written, and it is worth remembering. Don't let anyone throw away your albums, whatever they may be. Don't let anyone convince you your memories, your love, your presence aren't important. Protect them, honor them, and most of all, honor yourself. Because if there's one thing my story proves, it's this. Even when others try to erase you, you can write yourself into eternity. Because in the end, I wasn't erased, I was eternal.